Last time we spoke about the capture of Shanghai and Nanking. By early 1927, the NRA concentrated around Songqiang, planning a major assault against Shanghai while secretly preparing to attack Nanking. Capturing Nanking would isolate Sun Chuanfeng's forces. By February, Sun Chuanfeng's battered armies awaited reinforcements while the KMT incited disorder within Shanghai. The city's large workforce, influenced by the CCP, opposed Sun Chuanfeng's alliance with the Northerners and foreign powers. On February the 19th, the CCP launched a general strike, which was violently suppressed by Sun Chuanfeng's forces, leading to hundreds of deaths. Despite the failed uprising, the NRA advanced, exploiting defections within Sun Chuanfeng's ranks. By March, the NRA forces captured key positions, closing in on Nanking and Shanghai. Amidst this, Chiang Kai-shek faced internal strife with the CCP and KMT lefties, leading to disunity in the First United Front. The Wuhan faction undermined Chiang Kai-shek's authority, further complicating the northern expedition. By late March, the NRA seized Shanghai, while ongoing conflicts hinted at a potential collapse of the First United Front. This episode is the Northern Expedition Part 5, Collapse of the First United Front. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, found at YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. Over there, I just released a long-form documentary on the First Sino-Japanese War, and Episode 3 in an ongoing podcast series on the North Africa campaign during World War II. Also, if you find a chance, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. Last we left off, Chiang Kai-shek was basically at war with this new CCP-run cabal in Wuhan. They were taking away his authority one notch at a time. To counter the communist Wuhan cabal, Chiang Kai-shek appealed to the center and right-wingers within the KMT. Before the capture of Shanghai, an anti-communist group with members such as Wu Qihui, Nua Yongchun, and Yang Chuan, who had headquarters within the city, had been investigating how the CCP were subverting the KMT authority. On March the 6th, they began questioning the CCP leader, Chen Duxiu, and his Shanghai-based subordinate, Dou Yinyong, what exactly the intentions of the CCP were. Chen Duxiu said they would turn China communist, but it would take more than 20 years, and thus cooperation with the KMT was a necessity for the moment. After it was found out the CCP had fomented some worker attacks upon areas in Shanghai, this prompted anti-KMT demonstrations along the Nanking Road. Chiang Kai-shek was gaining more loyal followers to his side as the anti-communism grew amongst the KMT membership. When Shanghai was taken, Chiang Kai-shek sent letters to members of the Wuhan cabal that he considered not under the influence of the CCP, and he told them they should come to Shanghai. On March 24th, Chiang Kai-shek addressed a letter sent to Tan Yankai at Wuhan. Please forward this letter to the national government. Shanghai and Nanking have been occupied, and there is much work to be done here. I hope Committee Member Tan and Ministers Sun Fo and Song and Chen Yujin will come to Shanghai to handle affairs here so I can devote my attention to military matters. Yet he neglected to mention the insubordination running through the NRA ranks and the ongoing Nanking incident that was occurring that very day. Most of the men who received letters at Wuhan had a lot of grievances against the CCP, particularly because they felt betrayed. This, of course, was because initially the CCP had colluded with the left-wing KMT faction, led by Wang Jingwei. But he and the rest of the left wing had been left in the dust as the CCP simply took charge. By the end of March, the civil war between Wuhan and Chiang Kai-shek was becoming more and more visible. Both Wuhan and Shanghai began using the press to attack each other. From Wuhan, Borodin was accusing Shanghai of being reactionaries, and in return, Shanghai was calling into question how the communist influence emanating from Wuhan could be put to an end. The Wuhan cabal then began dismissing officers loyal to Chiang Kai-shek and turning military authority to the new Wuhan Military Council. Shanghai had their own cabal in the form of committees who retaliated against Wuhan. This saw a sort of battle over Jiangxi, as both cabals tried to dismiss each other's favorite officers. Yet the CCP within Shanghai began organizing a provisional municipal government and appointed CCP members to key positions. Upon discovering the new attack, Chiang Kai-shek labeled the CCP committees as enemy of the KMT and not to be recognized by the political party nor the NRA. April brought violence to the situation. In Shanghai, the CCP used its newfound cabal there to undermine Chiang Kai-shek's regime. Chiang Kai-shek responded by placing a curfew over the city and declaring publicly he would suppress all irregular movements. Word spread Chiang Kai-shek had invited a large group of KMT civil and military leaders from Guangzhou to Shanghai, where they were forming plans to counter the CCP threat in the two cities. Then word came that the CCP were seizing merchants in Wuhan and ransoming them, taking their businesses. In Shanghai, non-communist workers began complaining that they were being persecuted and even physically beaten by CCP unions. So the KMT-led unions began gathering non-communist workers and they created a labor organization with the intent of completely replacing the Communist Labor Union in Shanghai. Thus, if we look at this as a type of war, one front of it would be the labor front. From there, general strikes broke out at Shanghai and Hangzhou on the part of the CCP who were trying to oust Chiang Kai-shek. The KMT unions retaliated by burning down the CCP union's headquarters in Hangzhou and Ningbo. After this, the Wuhan Joint Council declared recent elections in Guangzhou to be illegal on the basis that they had already been ordered to disband and reorganize. In response, Guangzhou's government arrested agents that had been sent over by Wuhan and refused to comply with Wuhan's orders. Chiang Kai-shek now was deeply concerned about the stagnating northern expedition. Each day the NRA delayed, the NPA grew larger and more coordinated. Chiang Kai-shek still hoped to convince key KMT leaders to turn away from the CCP. To this purpose, in March, Chiang Kai-shek sent his close colleague, Jiang Qingqiang, to find Wang Jingwei and ask him to come back to China. Jiang Qingqiang wrote to Wang Jingwei, notifying him the CCP were trying to take over the entire movement and that they needed him to return from Europe. Wang Jingwei returned to Shanghai by April 1st, as Chiang Kai-shek notified his agents, "Comrade Wang Jingwei has returned, and I have had a serious conference with him about the party and the country. From now on, he will be responsible for the party, as well as political affairs. I will devote my attention to military operations. The military and civil administration, finance, and diplomacy will all be under Wang Jingwei and be consolidated in the central government. My armies and I will obey unanimously. Military authority and operation orders, however, I will direct as before." Wang Jingwei has indicated that he thinks there should be no intra-party conflict until the military operation has been completed, and that everyone should support the commander-in-chief until a discussion of the matters involved can be held. Talk about a 180. Wang Jingwei, of course, did not trust Chiang Kai-shek at all, and I'm sure the feeling was mutual. These two guys, after all, had been rivals fighting for leadership over the movement countless times. One crucial problem for Wang Jingwei was the fact he was the leader of the leftists in the movement, and he only really had power when combined with the CCP. Now, when Wang Jingwei came back home, he took a route going through Moscow and Vladivostok. Borodin had telegraphed him from Wuhan, telling him the CCP did not want to displace the KMT, nor did they seek to create a communist China. Wang Jingwei would state later that he came back to China hoping to bring the Wuhan faction back into the fold. On April 15th, Wang Jingwei took up his new position. Chiang Kai-shek pushed Wang Jingwei to call for an all-KMT gathering at Nanking to purge the CCP from the ranks. However, at that time, the Northern Expedition had units advancing against Henan, and quite a few of them had CCP officers. Wang Jingwei stated if they purged them now, it would threaten said units. Thus, the second week of April saw an increase in violence between the two groups. Riots broke out in Guangzhou, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, between unions leaving hundreds dead and wounded. The military forces at Shanghai began quelling armed workers as Chiang Kai-shek called upon the communist unions to disband the near 5,000 armed worker militias, or else, quote, they would be regarded as a conspiratorial organization, not to be permitted to exist. On April 6th, Chiang Kai-shek ordered some troops to raid and close down the CCP's political department in Shanghai, led by Kuomintang. On that same day, Jiang Zuolin raided the Soviet embassy at Beijing, and the Shanghai and Tianjin International Concession police raided their Soviet consulates. All of the evidence found was handed over to the KMT at Shanghai. Chiang Kai-shek hoped to use that information to prove the CCP were subverting the KMT and to bring about a purge. In early April, the Shanghai Control Committee urged Chiang Kai-shek to nip the bud of what looked like a CCP uprising. Many large meetings amongst the top KMT leaders followed, and all came to the conclusion the CCP were indeed trying to seize leadership over the movement and suppress the KMT. Now, I should mention by this point, everything I'm saying is very heavily contested, of course. Current-day CCP historians would paint a picture that it was actually Chiang Kai-shek who was the aggressor, whereas Taiwanese historians would say the opposite. What is actually known, and I think I have fairly portrayed it, is that there is a sort of civil war emerging in the First United Front. Both sides from the very beginning had goals they wanted to achieve at a cost to the other side. It really became one of those situations where it was the first one to pull the trigger would win. For quite some time, the Chinese and foreign press had covered the battle between the CCP and Chiang Kai-shek. During the first 2 weeks of April, multiple warnings had been sent by both sides openly that action would be taken. On April the 11th, 5,000 armed workers led by the CCP were warned military response was imminent. The armed workers currently picketing were warned, and their CCP leadership put out alerts in the major suburbs of Jiaibei, Pudong, Wusong, and South Shanghai. While the KMT prepared a purge against the CCP in Shanghai, the NPA launched a counteroffensive in northern Jiangsu. This would see the NRA face a succession of defeats through April. From April the 3rd to the 11th, the NRA fell back 100 miles through Jiangsu and Anhui, closing in towards Yangtze. On April the 5th, Wang Jingwei had landed in Shanghai. He was invited by Chiang Kai-shek. However, he quickly met in secrecy with Chen Duxiu. After their meeting, they both agreed to issue a joint declaration reaffirming the cooperation between the left KMT and the CCP. Wang Jingwei departed for Wuhan on the 6th, and it was at this point Chiang Kai-shek met up with his old buddy, Du Yuesheng, the leader of the Green Gang. They formed a rival union to face the CCP unions in Shanghai. On the 9th, Chiang Kai-shek declared martial law in Shanghai as the Central Control Commission proclaimed party protection and national salvation, denouncing the Wuhan CCP-backed government. On the 11th, Chiang Kai-shek secretly issued orders to all the provinces under NRA control to purge communists immediately from the KMT. At dawn on the 12th, Green Gang members began to assault district offices controlled by the CCP unions in places like Jiaibei, Pudong, and Nanchu. Using the martial law decree, Chiang Kai-shek unleashed the 26th Army upon the city, who quickly rounded up, disarmed, and fought armed worker militias. 300 people were killed and wounded as the CCP unions tried to organize a resistance. On the 13th, they denounced Chiang Kai-shek's actions as thousands of workers demonstrated in front of the 26th Army HQ. The soldiers there opened fire upon the demonstrators, killing perhaps 100 or so people and wounding many more. Chiang Kai-shek then dissolved the provincial government of Shanghai, the CCP-backed labor unions, and any organizations with ties to the CCP. He then reorganized a network of new unions, allied to his faction of the KMT, and had Du Yuesheng manage said operation. Some sources claim over 1,000 CCP members and left-wing supporters were arrested. 300 were executed, and more than 5,000 simply went missing. Now, when I say the word missing, you can imagine the 5,000 quote-unquote missing are probably dead. Others claim the number could have been as high as 10,000. This entire incident became known as the Shanghai Massacre. Now, this event effectively ended the First United Front, and it ushered in the Chinese Civil War. However, because of how I've been tackling the warlord era, I'd prefer to put the Civil War actually on the back burner just for now. We most certainly will come back to it. It's going to be a very long series. But for now, I think I'm just going to focus on warlord era China. After the break of the alliance, the Wuhan government stood still. as Chiang Kai-shek formed a separate government at Nanking. It came to no surprise when Wang Jingwei condemned Chiang Kai-shek for the purges and became leader of the rival Wuhan government. Go figure. This formally split the KMT right and left wings and their associated NRA forces. To celebrate the dire situation of the revolutionaries, Jiang Zuolin began an artillery bombardment of Nanking from across the Yangtze. Now saw a rather chaotic situation where two groups of NRA would both continue separate northern expeditions completely uncoordinated against a far larger NPA force. Now another aspect of all of this, perhaps less sexy to say, was the financial disparity between the CCP and the KMT. Shanghai was a reliable fiscal base, a repository of Chinese capital whose tax revenues far surpassed that of Wuhan, especially since Wuhan was seeing unbelievable worker strikes, pushed by the CCP of course. Her economy was free-falling. Wuhan's total annual revenues from the affiliated provinces had shrunk to a fourth of that of Shanghai. Over at Guangzhou, the central bank continued to hold the majority of the KMT hard currency and her silver reserves. Thus, Wuhan had been printing money like crazy, devaluating it, something a Canadian like I knows a lot about. The KMT finance minister TV Sung had moved to Wuhan in the beginning, but quickly was frustrated with the situation and he fled for Shanghai as soon as the city was captured. Chiang Kai-shek managed to win over the bankers and the leading businessmen, which was not hard given his opponent was, well, communism. When violence broke out at Nanking against the foreign community, Chiang Kai-shek was between a rock and a hard place. He needed to avoid any confrontation with foreign powers, but his KMT base and the people of China wanted to break the chains of foreign imperialism. Thus, he made some fiery speeches stating things like this. The objective of the national revolution is to seek international equality. If a nation treats China fairly, China will return friendship. As long as foreign troops and warships undertake to protest, we will not be responsible. Incidents are unavoidable in a revolution. Chiang Kai-shek walked a tightrope with the foreign powers. On one hand, he constantly was negotiating with them to return concessions, but he always made sure to thwart any rationales for them to militarily intervene. Whereas at Wuhan, they found themselves suffering from large-scale unemployment, a crumbling economy, political tensions, revenues disappearing, and quite a lot of hostility from the foreign powers, Shanghai looked a hell of a lot more stable in all those categories. Borden watched as the Wuhan regime was collapsing, and he began advising the CCP to ease up on the labor and peasant movements to allow the economy to recover. The Wuhan government had been dealt many terrible blows, but was still standing. Come May of 1927, Wuhan began massing their troops in an attempt to showcase to the movement they could continue the northern expedition. They wanted their troops to be the first ones in North China. Hopefully they would win over more support. The timing of the Wuhan offensive into Henan just so happened to coincide with some of Wu Peifu's forces in Henan defecting. The commander-in-chief of the Wuhan forces, Tang Chengji, then performed their first offensive, serving Wu Peifu a defeat near Kuomintang. Tang Chengji then advanced north, meeting defensive lines defended by Jiang Shuliang, the son of Jiang Zuolin. Within the center of this line was the town of Xiping, where the Beijing-Hankow Railway crossed a formidable river. The Wuhan forces pushed Jiang Shuliang further back after 3 days of battle until they withdrew north of Yancheng on May the 15th. Jiang Shuliang again took up a defensive line along a river. He placed heavy artillery behind fortified positions and he tried to hold out against the incoming NRA forces. The NRA advanced towards the river and went downstream from Yancheng, threatening to outflank Jiang Shuliang and his railway station to his rear. Yet the Wuhan forces were not the only ones in the fight, for the old Christian warlord Feng Yusung unleashed his army from Shanxi. Feng Yusung came out of the Wei River Valley with his Kuomintang and he passed through the Tongquan Pass on May the 6th. He first captured Kuomintang, a mountain gateway leading to Liaoyang. After taking Liaoyang on May the 28th, Feng Yusung was 70 miles from Chengzhou, which held the Beijing-Hankow Railroad bridgehead along the Yellow River. Jiang Shuliang responded to the new threat to his rear by withdrawing further north. When Jiang Shuliang took up a position north of the Yellow River, he now had a secure and shortened railway supply line, thus he could face a two-front war against Wuhan and the Kuomintang. Advancing quickly across the northern parts of Henan, Feng Yusung's cavalry vanguard beat Wuhan's NRA forces to Chengzhou and Kaifeng by late May. From there, Feng Yusung's forces straddled the Langhai Railway. Meanwhile, on May the 10th, Chiang Kai-shek's 1st and 6th NRA armies crossed the Yangtze into Anhui. On the 16th, Li Zhongren advanced into western Anhui to attack Hefei. By the 20th, Li Zhongren captured Bangbu, while Chiang Kai-shek unleashed a four-pronged defensive through Jiangsu to reach Shandong. He Yingjin led the 1st NRA army to capture Haizhou by late May. On the 28th, Li Zhongren took Shuzhou. And now with the Beijing-Hankou Railway under NRA and Kuomintang control, the line of communication extended to all three forces. Feng Yusung began receiving offers from both Wuhan and Nanking at this point. Feng Yusung first met with Wang Jingwei and Tang Shengzhi at Zhengzhou on June the 10th before traveling to Shuzhou on the 19th to meet Chiang Kai-shek. Both needed his help if they hoped to take North China. Feng Yusung, of course, was entirely dependent on the Soviet Union, so it seemed clear Wuhan was much more in line with him. However, he really needed to pick a faction that could satisfy his interests. For example, which revolutionary movement would survive this little civil war? What if Chiang Kai-shek won over more of the Wuhan leadership and defeated the CCP cabal over there? Could the Wuhan government actually challenge Chiang Kai-shek when he held all the resource-rich territories? Feng Yusung looked upon Wuhan's numerous economic and political issues. He also saw how aggressive their CCP peasant unions were in Hunan, constantly confiscating land. He looked at Nanking. It had enormous resources. Hell, Nanking promised him $2.5 million a month to maintain his Kuomintang, plus military aid and a nice position as chairman over the new provincial government over Hunan. Despite Feng Yusung's takeover of Hunan's lucrative arsenal within the Low Valley, he had a very poor industrial foundation. He did not really have much Shanxi personnel equipped to make the arsenal shine, so to say, so he would be dependent on external aid for quite some time. His aid from the Soviets in the north was quite vulnerable as well. The aid had to be transported over an incredibly long distance overland from the north. Any intelligent warlord could cut this off. Feng Yusung started to calculate which one would be more profitable. Stick with the Soviet aid, thus join Wuhan, or break with the Soviets for Nanking. Now something else occurred that would have dire consequences for the Wuhan regime. On June the 1st, Joseph Stalin sent a telegram to Borodin and his associate M.N. Roy with orders for the Wuhan government. Without consulting Borodin, M.N. Roy revealed the telegram to Wang Jingwei and held the following instructions. Insistent that every effort be made for land to be occupied by the Communist Party. However, actions that are too aggressive should be avoided, and officials' and soldiers' lands should be exempted. Make concessions to artisans, merchants, and small landlords. Mobilize 20,000 communists and 50,000 revolutionary workers and farmers to raise an army. Recruit new leaders from the workers and farmers of the lower stratum to join the KMT so as to alter the composition of the party. Expel all of those old mindsets. Establish a revolutionary military court headed by well-known party officials and non-communists to punish reactionary officials. Wang Jingwei believed these instructions would be the death of the Wuhan government, but continued to negotiate with the Soviets because, hell, he had little choice when they were providing so much of the needed assistance. Wang Jingwei demanded the Soviets provide 15 million rubles in aid, but the Soviets only agreed to 2 million. This prompted a very angry Wang Jingwei to threaten to send Borodin back to Moscow. The event became known as the May Instructions, and it compelled Wang Jingwei to break off from the USSR. However, even doing so, he certainly was not joining Chiang Kai-shek. In a vain effort to counter the CCP and Chiang Kai-shek, Wang Jingwei sought Feng Yusung's help. Without informing his CCP colleagues, Wang Jingwei dispatched Deng Yanda to meet with Feng Yusung at Zhengzhou, offering every possible concession he could think of. Wang Jingwei had no idea Feng Yusung was already in talks with Chiang Kai-shek, however. Now, Wang Jingwei was not the only one unhappy with the Soviet instructions. Even Chen Duxiu would go on the record to say he did not think they fit the reality in China, and that it was nearly impossible to implement them. The Soviets were very displeased with the situation in China, particularly that the First United Front had more or less collapsed. By late June, the Soviets were considering breaking ties with the Wuhan government. This prompted a panicked Chen Duxiu and Borodin to try and quell radicals within the Wuhan clique to try and retain the small united front between the leftists in the KMT and the CCP. They frantically told workers and peasant unions to stop activity for just a while so things could stabilize. However, ironically, the Soviets saw all of this as opportunism and recalled Borodin by early July, and they pulled out of the KMT deal. Needless to say, Fang Yusung chose to ally himself to Chiang Kai-shek. He did so by sending a joint telegram in late June to Wang Jingwei, telling him and demanding the Wuhan government expel all of its Soviet advisors and purge itself of communists so they could all work together and continue the northern expedition. While this was going on, Tang Chengzhi's forces were being mauled by heavy artillery in North China. Tang Chengzhi was wounded badly, and believing Fang Yusung would not help them out, Wang Jingwei withdrew the forces back to Hubei, Hunan, and Jiangxi. After taking some time to recover, Tang Chengzhi advanced his forces out of Wuhan through Jiangxi to face Nanking's forces near Anqing in Anhui. Chiang Kai-shek had his forces respond to the threat defensively. On July the 13th, Chiang Kai-shek pulled his front-line forces, trying to enter Shandong back. Meanwhile, the civilian population of Wuhan were no longer supporting the government. Tang Chengzhi began to dig in around Anqing, threatening Nanking. When Chiang Kai-shek moved his front-line units near Shandong south to defend against Zhangzhou, the NPA began to claim lost territory. In early July, the NPA recaptured Tongxian, Lincheng, Caocheng, and the Tianjin-Pukou railway line. Despite losing Henan in June, the NPA now enjoyed a shorter logistical line in front, allowing them to deploy their heavy artillery in concentration while Nanking was fighting a two-front war. The NRA forces were being battered by the NPA now. In the face of mounting losses, both the Wuhan and Nanking governments began negotiations. Wang Jingwei had procrastinated as long as he possibly could, but Fang Yusung was not going to help him out. Chiang Kai-shek was certainly not either, and the CCP and the Soviet overlords were trying to take over. Thus, on July the 15th, Wang Jingwei held a KMT meeting, and he formally published the May Instructions letter while condemning the CCP. He unleashed a purge, though he did so less bloodily compared to what happened at Shanghai. The Wuhan and Nanking governments met, and they passed the policy of uniting the party, while all communists were kicked out of the KMT and the NRA. The Wuhan government sent all of their Soviet advisors back to Moscow, as Wang Jingwei proclaimed the CCP had ruined the revolution publicly. KMT forces loyal to Chiang Kai-shek took over Wuhan, and by July the 18th, the Wuhan area was cleansed of the communists. However, Wang Jingwei had made one demand to reunite the KMT. He demanded Chiang Kai-shek resign from his post as commander-in-chief and relinquish all of their political titles. And you know what? Chiang Kai-shek did just that on August the 12th. The Generalissimo was no more. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, over at YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. Over on the YouTube channel, I just released a long-form documentary on the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. And as for podcasts, I'm on episode 3 of a brand new series on the North African campaign during World War II. Also, I just want to give a big shout out because I recently had a lot of people join my Patreon, and a few of them said they came from this podcast. Again, to check it out, it's at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. The First United Front had come to an end. A new civil war was born. Because of the war between Wuhan and Nanking, the NPA got the upper hand yet again, reclaiming vast amounts of territory. To reunify the KMT, Wang Jingwei demanded Chiang Kai-shek walk away. And walk away he did. What would happen now to the northern expedition?